Our second speaker is Dr. Tom Clark, a neurologist who has been a student of Gurdjieff's writings and teachings since 1974. He completed his neurology residency in New York in 95 and over the past 30 years has practiced in many capacities, including a stroke doctor, medical expert, and instructor of students and residents. He has worked to understand Beelzebub's tales in relation to medicine and neurology. His talk today is titled Sacred Neuroscience.
First of all, thank you for inviting me to participate in this conference. It is a privilege, and it's a privilege to be here in this beautiful city at this wonderful conference. Thank you. A few things to clarify. In the notes or the program, it says I'm a neuroscientist. I don't consider myself a scientist, let alone a neuroscientist, and I'm hardly a scholar or academic. So bear with me. I first read the Beelzebub's Tales in 1974 as a 19-year-old. Now, I probably understood a lot less of that than most of the people in the room going through it the first time. But it has shaped how I view the world, how I see myself, and it inspired me, that and the Gurdjieff teaching, to return to school in my late 20s, go to medical school, and go through a residency in neurology. These ideas have shaped how I approached it and how I deal with it and practice it today. So, for instance, I've had a quote from Mullah Nasruddin on the wall of my office for some 20 years. And some people have actually mentioned it, but it's the quote that Mullah Nasruddin says, "For our sins, God has given us two kinds of physicians, one kind to help us die, and the other to prevent us living." There's also a couple of other references. I forget where it was, but somebody asked Gurdjieff, why do you talk this is in Paris someplace, why do you spend so much time speaking with these older people? And I'd love to find the reference again, but he says, I talk to them to help them prepare to die, which I thought was incredible. And I believe it's at the end of the Tales where he talks about, what has to be done in order to change. And one of the things he mentions is when you set your eyes on another human being, you realize that they are going to die. And in my practice now, I work in a hospital that I see people probably a lot closer to that than hopefully me or anybody else in this room. So I find that very, very helpful guidance. So it's interesting because Mr. Gurdjieff talks about medicine, neurology, and a lot of other things throughout the book. And most people can remember the part about Dober's powder. I think that's very funny, knowing what I know about the practice of medicine. He talks about the confusion over the word doctor. There's a lot of doctors in the room, and I don't know if there's that many physicians. And I know that, my friend Peter here has experience with being confused with a physician. So anyway, as mentioned by Michael Pittman and somebody earlier, Gurdjieff had a prodigious sense of humor. So this is his first reference to neuroanatomy. My brain, which is constructed to the point of mockery. I love that. Anyway, he goes on to say, and I wonder whether anybody even remembers the reference, but this picture here is a picture of Jean-Martin Charcot, the guy with the pointing his finger or holding something right in the middle there. I don't know if anybody remembers the reference, but Charcot was an early practitioner or tried to be a practitioner of hypnosis. And his big thing was dealing with hysteria, all right, which is okay. This is a famous picture, by the way, and there's some other famous neurologists, Tourette, de la Tourette. Somebody may have heard of Tourette syndrome, and Babinski. They're in the picture too. I can't identify them. But what Gurdjieff says later on, Charcot had the typical properties of a mama's darling. So this is the father of modern neurology. So when I look at that, this is the field I chose. Kind of hard to take yourself too seriously. So anyway, and excuse me, I'm a little jet lagged, so I seem a little slow on the uptake. Cut me some slack. So over the past 30 plus years, since I started my residency in New York, I read numerous articles and texts, listened to lectures by numerous, or a multitude of professors and other experts, reviewed countless MRI and CT scans of the brain and spine, and taught young residents and medical students. In my field, we are tasked with the evaluation, diagnosis, and treatment of disorders of the nervous system, inclusive of the brain, spinal cord, nerves, and muscles. However, not once in all these years, throughout interaction with professors, colleagues, residents, and students, has anyone ever posited the question as to what is the inherent nature of the human nervous system and for what purpose was it designed to serve. Buried within the tales lie the answers to these unasked questions of contemporary neuroscience, including that of the inherent design of the human nervous system and its purpose within the megalocosmos. The answers are not theoretical. They're real, tangible, and verifiable. And so, the three brain beings of the planet Earth are not only, as we also are, apparatuses for the transformation of cosmic substances required for the most great Trogo-Auto-Egocrat, with the qualities of all three forces of the fundamental common cosmic triamazicamno, but also themselves absorbing these substances for transformation from the three different sources of independent arisings, have all the possibilities of assimilating, besides the substances necessary for the maintenance of their own existence, also those substances which go for the coding and perfecting of their higher being bodies. So, where then, anatomically, in the planetary body of an ordinary human being are the three centers, moving, emotional, and intellectual centers located? How are they connected in an ordinary human being? How could they be connected in a properly functioning and awake, normal human being? What are the consequences of the abnormal connections and improper use of these centers and their effect on morbidity, disease, and the duration of existence of ordinary human beings? And what can be considered as normal? In the Gurdjieff version, which I'm sure some of you have read, C. Daly King states, "The normal is that which functions in accordance with its inherent design. And when, and only when, such harmonious functioning is present, can the organism be said to be normal. When it is absent, the organism is abnormal." The anatomic structures that comprise the three centers or brains referred to in the tales are recognized in intricate detail by contemporary neuroscience, and the understanding of the function and the causes of dysfunction of these structures increases exponentially. Nonetheless, modern science, as my colleague Dmitry Heretsky said, modern science is third force blind. They don't understand the effect of consciousness and awareness on science. Like I said, well, nobody ever questioned why we're here. All the people I've talked to, I see a bunch of human nervous systems sitting here. I can talk about that here, not in these other places. So anyway, The brain determined by great nature for the concentration and further actualization of the first holy force of the sacred Tridymazicamno, called the holy affirming, is localized in the head. The primary structures of the thinking or intellectual center reside in the cerebrum, 2 hemispheres, and connect with and direct the moving center via the frontal lobes for decision making, the motor cortices in the posterior frontal lobes, and through the cortical spinal tracts. And again, a lot of these technical terms, in a short presentation, we can't really go through them and explain them, but if I do have some diagrams, and you can access my paper. Anyway, they go through the basal ganglia brainstem to the spinal cord. Off the spinal cord, you have nerve roots, which innervate the muscles and nerves of the limbs and other things. They send electrical messages throughout the peripheral nerves to muscles and muscle groups of the head, trunk, and limbs. The function of the head brain, including structures that subserve memory, language, problem solving, decision making, etc., is a marvel of evolutionary biology. Yet in the absence of conscious awareness, it is no more than what Gurdjieff has described as an apparatus or typewriter. Today, he would probably refer to the head brain as a computer. This second brain, which transforms and crystallizes the second holy force of the sacred Tridymazicamno, namely the holy denying, is placed in their common presences, also as in us, the folks up at planet Caritas, along the whole of their back in what is called the spinal column. He uses the term spinal marrow, but it's a spinal cord within the vertebrae of the back. The sensory nerves and nerve endings throughout the body conduct electrical signals regarding pain, pressure, light touch, vibration, and proprioception, which is the feeling of a limb or part of the body in space, through the afferent tracts and the same nerve roots to the ascending sensory tracts of the spinal cord, brainstem, and deep structures of the brain, including the thalamus. We don't have to get into the technical terms here. The moving center then comprises both sensory and motor function in a persistent feedback loop capable of functioning on a high level without conscious awareness. Think of somebody playing a sport or driving a car, doing all kinds of things. It doesn't, you don't have to be aware and able to do these things. But as regards the place of concentration and source for the further manifestation of the third holy force of the sacred Tridymazicamno, namely the holy reconciling, the exterior form of this being brain in the three brain beings there bears no resemblance to ours. Concerning the place of concentration of this localization, which serves the common presences of terrestrial three brain beings as a regularizing or reconciling principle, it must be noticed that in the beginning, these three brain beings of the planet Earth who have taken your fancy also had this third concentration similar to us in the form of the independent brain localized in the region of what is called breast. I believe this was before Kundabuffer. The emotional, let's see. And so the three brain beings of the planet Earth are not only, as also we are, apparatuses. I don't know if I lost my place. It's the jet lag. I'm sure that's what it is. Are not only as we are, apparatuses for transformation of cosmic substances. I think I read this already. Let me go back to this. They're talking about the emotional center. The said being brain was localized in the same part of their planetary body as in us, and had an exterior form exactly similar to our own. But great nature was compelled little by little to regenerate this brain and give it the form which it now has in contemporary beings. In implicit in this statement is that we are not as we should be, and that the human organism perhaps was, but is no longer, readily constructed to serve its higher purpose. So I mentioned this before, all this medical knowledge, and this is one of the handbooks, Principles of Neuroscience, very scientific. They have no idea about consciousness or the three forces or the three centers. So the process of work on oneself, that is self-remembering, self-observation, non-identification, and the struggle against negative emotions, result in physiologic changes and connections between and among the centers. The substances of the food cycle are transmuted by these efforts into pituitary in the cerebrum, or via the corticopontine cerebellar tract, which is back here. Center 4, located in the cerebellum, back here, is activated as is center 5, the higher emotional center localized in the heart. The lower centers continue to function, but with new connections, and are thus subservient to the higher centers. So, we'll go back one. The mechanical behavior of any particular human being can be attributed to a lack of conscious awareness and centers that are not functioning properly and in harmony, as the connections were made unconsciously. A modern man lives in sleep he is born, and in sleep he dies. In this state, man walks the street, writes books, talks on lofty subjects, takes part in politics, and kills one another. That's Gurdjieff as recorded by Ouspensky in In Search of the Miraculous. So, even with the dispersal and displacement of the anatomic correlates of the third holy force, or sacred triamazikamno, three-brain beings have the possibility personally to perfect themselves, because in them there are localized three centers of their common presence, or three brains, upon which, afterwards, when the process of Jarklam proceeds in the omnipresent Okidanak, the three forces of the sacred triamazikamno are deposited and acquire the possibility for further, this time independent actualizing. So I realize there's a lot of neologisms from Gurdjieff that are in my paper. If you have trouble accessing the paper, please contact me. I'll make sure you get a copy. So the thinking center resides within the skull and is comprised of cortical structures of both hemispheres as well as subcortical and deep structures. Its functions include interpretation of sensory and emotional input and the initiation of movement and autonomic human activity. The abnormal functioning of the head brain includes activities common to each of us, I assume common to each of us, like fantasy, considering, identification, and daydreaming, like an errant typewriter. And that efforts to struggle against these can lead to harmonious connections between the centers. How much time we got? Okay. Spinal cord or spinal marrow conducts messages to and from the head brain regarding the sensation and movements of the head, trunk, and limbs. It is constructed to execute a myriad of tasks and functions automatically, that is, without thought, feeling, or awareness. And I think the example in my paper, things like learning to ride a bicycle, learning to drive, learning to type, when you first do it, your head brain is involved. Once you learn to do it, it's automatic. In fact, you could be driving along daydreaming and fantasizing, and not hit anybody and arrive safely. So all automatic, unconscious human activities occurs due to the activation and process of these neurologic structures. Now, talking about the third concentration, the emotional center, that picture's a little confusing, but what it is you have this autonomic structures that eh, originate in the brain and go through and literally the pit of the stomach, where the solar plexus is the pit of the stomach. And we'll go through the wholly reconciling or emotional center includes the dispersed sympathetic and parasympathetic nodes, as he calls it, of the autonomic nervous system localized in the chest and abdomen, as well as corresponding deep structures in the head brain, including several other things, hypothalamus, brainstem, and limbic system. One good way to understand the poor connections between the centers and the effect of the autonomic nervous system is that, and I'm sure some of you may have had this kind of experience, but here I am fantasizing, oh my God, I got to give this talk today. And does my hair look okay? I mean, is my voice going to hold up? I mean, these people are smarter than me and they're just going to be bored and start leaving right away, and of course, then the autonomic system kicks in, my heart rate, it jumps up, I start sweating and feel like I have to use the restroom or whatever. But you see how the poor connections lead to activities and experiences that we all have. And so if you want to get a look at these pictures later, I'm happy to show that to you, the limbic system. So how many minutes now? 5. No. I got to speed up. So you can understand the three centers if you know the absence of good connections, but also understanding what the possibilities are with normal connections of the centers. And we'll skip over some of this stuff because Gurdjieff actually, I like this. He mentions this in a couple of his books about neuropathology. He said he studied it at Kars Military Hospital. And what he brings up the topic of what's called bobbin Candlemas. And I don't know if anybody's familiar with this term. Had they read about it? But it's like the three centers have a limit of what their experience can be, a number of experiences. And he compares that to mechanical watches and a spring. Okay. And you can read this in my paper, but he actually talks about this. One of the aphorisms on the study house wall is man is given a definite number of experiences. Economizing them, he prolongs his life. There are examples of the kinds of things that speed up the unwinding of the bobbin Candlemas, and we don't have enough time to go through that. He mentions the term Iram Samkeep as something that not to give up oneself to those of one's associations, resulting from the functioning of one or another of one's brain. And people are familiar with his talk about the hackney and how the centers are connected. In the paper, we talk about how that analogy is related to the actual three centers. So Dr. Christian Werdenbacher, I don't know if anybody's ever read his books. He's a professor at Albert Einstein. I think he's just retired. He has a book, and it talks about the anatomic correlates of the three centers and suggests that if the body's electromagnetic activity is organized and functional on a macroscopic level, a realm of possible interactions unknown to current scientific thinking may exist. Could the proper alignment and integration of anatomic structures comprising the three centers result in accruing powers or changing the influences under which a normal, completed human being may be subject to? So, Gurdjieff talks about teleogenora, a materialized idea or thought, accessing them or accessing core reptilian thought types. In the third series, he mentions something which I think is very telling. He says, I could attain almost anything within the limits of man's possibilities, and in some fields attain even to such a degree of power as not one man has ever attained. For instance, the power of my thoughts have been brought to such a degree of power that by only a few hours of preparation, I could kill from a distance of tens of miles, kill a yak. Whether that's true or not, it suggests that we have capabilities that we haven't even considered. So there's a story that Fritz Peters told in his book about he had fought for the American Army during World War II, and he was exhausted. He came to see Gurdjieff in Paris, and after being served a cup of hot coffee by Gurdjieff, began to feel a strange uprising of energy within himself. He stared at Gurdjieff, automatically straightened up, and felt as if there was a violent electric blue light emanating from Gurdjieff, entering into him. As this happened, he could feel the tiredness drain out of himself, but at the same moment, his body slumped, or at the same moment, Gurdjieff's body slumped and his face turned gray as if it was being drained of life. I think that's a remarkable description of the use of higher energies. So, I'm almost done. 1 minute I got. So, give an extra 5 seconds. In the Arajian version, C. Daly King, he's a little critical of Gurdjieff, but he says something important. He said, cannot fail to suppose that the serious head injuries that Gurdjieff sustained altered his later activities and his whole approach to the task which he devoted his energies. Once he ran an institute, now he's reduced to writing books. But he had a quality that he possessed to a degree greater than it would ever occur to him could exist had he not met Mr. Gurdjieff. It is a quality not of mind or of feeling or of successful accomplishment, but of being. Notwithstanding King's speculation regarding the extent and effects of Gurdjieff's injuries, it would appear that Gurdjieff had tapped into some higher powers through his efforts and proper integration of his centers to write by force of will, all and everything, and pass on his ideas and teaching in the form of a legomenism for generations to come. Thank you.